Welcome to War Stories and Fairy Tales. I'm Scott, I'm your layman, and this is our history of war. Today is Martin Luther King Day 2025. Well, actually I missed it by about a week because I've been sick, but this is the war story I meant to tell for MLK Day. On the third Monday in January, we remember the life and contributions of an amazing man, a leader, and a visionary. So who was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, you could create a whole channel just talking about Dr. King, his life, and what he did for race relations in the U.S. Hell, I did a YouTube search for his name and found a couple hundred channels. So there's not much chance I'm going to do him justice in a 20-minute video, but I'm going to try. If you live in the U.S., you've heard about this man probably every week or at least every month for most of your life. Mostly about his dream, which we'll get to here in a bit. You know he was a leader of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and you probably know he was committed to nonviolent resistance to injustice. He wasn't about throwing punches, which he thought would hurt his movement more than it would help. If you're not from the U.S., you probably heard his name, and you might have heard a couple of key lines from the I Have a Dream speech he gave in Washington in 1963. Again, we'll get to that in a few minutes. But how did he get there? Why did thousands of people go to Washington to hear him talk about his dream? Well, Dr. King was a black Baptist minister who grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. His father taught him from an early age that the racism and segregation they lived with was a fact of life, but that didn't make it right. He learned from his dad that even if he couldn't change the system he lived under, he didn't have to just accept it. He learned to speak in public in high school, and at 15 he was admitted to Morehouse College. There he figured out his best chance of making a difference in the world as a talented black orator in the United States was to become a preacher. He was called as pastor of a Baptist church in Montgomery, Alabama in 1954 and received his doctorate in divinity in 1955. And he pretty much immediately got to work on behalf of black Americans. He was one of the leaders and organizers of the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, the boycott that began when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. That boycott lasted more than a year, and at the end of it, the Supreme Court declared the laws that segregated public buses unconstitutional. And suddenly, Dr. King was a national figure, the face of the civil rights movement. He and several other civil rights leaders founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, in 1957. And they started organizing nonviolent resistance movements all over the southern U.S. Nonviolence was key to the movement, he figured. A group of black people rioting against injustice could be spun as just a bunch of thugs disturbing the peace and destroying property. Come to think of it, that does sound familiar. But yeah, it's hard to see some poor bastard getting his ass kicked by a police officer or a Klansman as anything but a victim if he's not even trying to hit back. And it was images like that, Dr. King figured, that would help the U.S. see the injustice in how they treated people who looked like him. So the SCLC and his leadership of the civil rights movement would keep him busy until 1964. Let's take a broader look at what he was up against. So white Americans had shitty relations with black people for pretty much our entire history, because the first black people ever brought to North America were brought as slaves. It turned out, speaking in very general terms, that black people's heritage in Africa, where lots of old world diseases are endemic, made them more resistant to the European diseases the settlers brought with them than the Native American population, which meant they could do hard work around Europeans, while the Native Americans couldn't. Now, it's true that not all black people in North America before the Civil War were slaves, but it was common enough that when somebody encountered a free black person, especially in the South, it was unusual enough to be remarked on. It is true the slaves in North America mostly lived and worked in better conditions than their counterparts in the Caribbean, but slightly less shitty is still shitty. And there's the simple fact that they lived as slaves with no rights of their own and no say over the way they lived their lives. Can you imagine living according to somebody else's wants and needs and thinking that was okay? Sure, parents do it for a few years, but even parents get breaks occasionally. And kids grow up and become more independent, where a slave picks cotton or tobacco until his master decides he's too old to keep going, or until he dies, whichever comes first. Well, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in 1865, right after the Civil War, finally outlawed slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment made black people citizens in 1868, and the 15th gave them the right to vote in 1870. And for a while, it looked like we had turned a corner. Then Reconstruction ended, which, if you don't know what that was, it's the name we give to the years after the Civil War, where federal troops occupied the southern states to make sure secession was really and truly dead. And when it ended, the southern states took charge of their own territories again. Now here's the thing about law and culture. Culture almost always wins. And the culture of the U.S. South, the states that seceded to form the Confederate States of America, said black people were inferior to white people. So whatever the laws coming out of Washington said, Southern culture was going to damn well do its best to preserve that inferiority. So just as soon as the federal troops marched home, the South started trying to figure out how to keep their culture without bringing the feds back down on their asses. The solution they came up with was called Jim Crow, a collection of laws and customs that made sure black people stayed in their own neighborhoods and couldn't build any kind of wealth. Laws that dictated where black people could buy property. Laws that allowed businesses to refuse service to black people, or refuse to hire them, or limited the kind of jobs they could have. Police departments that turned a blind eye when white mobs killed black people, a practice known as lynching. And even on those rare occasions when white people might be tried for crimes against black people, the fact that black people couldn't serve on juries meant those white people probably wouldn't face any punishment. And of course they couldn't let them vote, no matter what the law said. Hell, some towns and even whole counties in the Deep South had more black people than white people. If they could vote, they'd elect black mayors, city councils, sheriffs, maybe even representatives to Congress. And they certainly couldn't allow something like that. And Jim Crow held on until after World War II ended in 1945, when black service members came home from the war and saw their white comrades treated like heroes while they were expected just to go back to being second-class citizens. That was what really galvanized the civil rights movement. And by August 1963, the movement was big enough that 250,000 people traveled to Washington, D.C. to show the government it was time to quit fucking around. And to hear Dr. King speak. It was there at the March on Washington that he gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, in which he shared his vision of an American nation that lives up to its ideals not just to the benefit of some, but all, regardless of what they look like. If you've ever heard Dr. King speak, you've probably heard part of that speech. And that speech inspired even more people to take action. Of course, it didn't inspire governments in the South to take action unless it was to double down on what they could still do to keep the black people in their place. After all, if you can keep them from voting, you don't really need to worry about whether or not they're happy. So how did they do that? After all, if the Constitution says they have a right to vote, you have to let them vote, right? Well, sure. So the voter registrar's office will be open for black people on the first and third Mondays of every month from 10 o'clock to 2 o'clock. I mean, if it's important to them, they'll figure out how to get time off from their jobs, right? And in the unlikely event they actually manage to get registered, they have to pay a poll tax to actually vote. A poll tax that's high enough to be a burden for poor people, but not for middle class or wealthy people. And poor whites are exempt anyway because their grandfathers had the right to vote. Yeah, that's where we get the term grandfather clause from. And if they can somehow pay the poll tax, there's also a literacy test they have to take in order to prove they can read a ballot. Except the test is 3 pages long with 30 questions. The instructions are deliberately confusing even if you can read well, and an educated person is going to have a hard time passing it in the 10-minute time limit. And if you get one question wrong, you don't get to vote. Oh, that white guy who just walked in who can barely spell his own name? Yeah, his grandfather could vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 made a lot of things better. It made racial segregation and discrimination illegal and outlawed separate voter registration requirements based on race. But it didn't go far enough. When long lines formed outside registrar's office, aggressive sheriffs could still arrest black people for loitering. So the demonstrations continued. And in early 1965, President Johnson started pushing a new bill that would eventually become the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But it was far from a done deal. And Dr. King and the SCLC, along with another organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, started coming up with ways to hurry the process along. The BS meter for this war story is about a 2 out of 10. It's about as accurate as I can make it, with a few details simplified for clarity. After all, there's a whole movie and a bunch of books on these marches. If this war story gets your wheels turning, go read up on civil rights. No shit, there they were. So in January and February of 1965, there were several organized attempts to register black people to vote in Selma, Alabama. Most of them broken up by the county sheriff's office. Several people were arrested, including Dr. King, and a few injured. And about 100 black people successfully registered to vote. Now, the population of Selma in 1965 was about 28,000 people. I couldn't find the demographic breakdown for 65, but today the city is about 80% black. And in February 1965, the city had 9,500 white people registered to vote and 300 black people. You don't have to do any math to see there's something wrong with this picture. So on the evening of the 18th of February, yet another demonstration took place. This one was in Marion, nearby, not Selma, but the pattern was similar. State troopers turned off the streetlights and attacked the crowd, and a young man named Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot in the stomach and died 8 days later. And the SCLC came up with the idea to march a group of demonstrators from Selma to Montgomery, about 54 miles, to petition the governor, George Wallace, directly. 3 times they tried to make the march. The first attempt came on the 7th of March. Dr. King actually wasn't there for this one. It was Sunday morning, and he was preaching at his father's church in Atlanta. His plan was to join the marchers along the route, march most of the distance with them, and be there for the discussion with the governor when they made it to Montgomery. But the state of Alabama had other plans. The governor claimed the march would be a threat to public safety as the marchers would be traveling along Highway 80. And he said not no, but hell no. So when 600 demonstrators tried to march out of Selma over the Edmund Pettus Bridge toward Montgomery, they found the way blocked by sheriff's deputies reinforced by a posse, many of them on horseback. The demonstrators asked to discuss the situation with the cops. The cops gave them 2 minutes to disperse, and after 2 minutes, they started in. Because the disadvantage of a nonviolent movement is that it's a seriously big picture kind of operation. You get pictures and films on the news of people getting their asses kicked or even being killed without resisting the guys who are hurting them, and you have some powerful images to inspire the powers that be to take action to prevent it happening again. But the poor bastards on the ground? They're going to have to get their asses kicked for that to happen. And they're not going to be able to fight back. And at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that's what happened. Some of the cops fired tear gas into the crowd. Some started in on them with clubs. And some rode horses into the crowd, hitting people with clubs and even bullwhips. 17 marchers went to the hospital with serious wounds, and 50 others were treated for minor injuries. Today we call this march Bloody Sunday. 2 days later, on the 9th, Dr. King led another attempt. this time with about 2,500 marchers. But this one wasn't actually a real attempt. It was more like a demonstration. He led the marchers to the middle of the bridge, looked out at the waiting sheriff's deputies, had everybody kneel down while he said a prayer, and turned the marchers around and headed back to the start point. We called this one Turnaround Tuesday. His intent was to demonstrate that the marchers were complying with the law, but it pissed a lot of people off, people on his side, because it was a surprise to most of the marchers. King asked them to stick around. He was confident that they would be able to get a judge to say they could go in the next few days. But that night, 3 Unitarian Universalist ministers went out to find something to eat in Selma, and several Klan members stalked them and beat the shit out of them. James Reeb, a minister from Boston, died in the hospital 2 days later. Well, as you can imagine, that ratcheted up the pucker factor even more. SNCC, that's the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, if you don't remember, lost some trust in the SCLC after Dr. King's turnaround on the 9th. And after Reverend Reeb's murder, they started leading some more aggressive protests in Montgomery. One of these protests turned violent on the 16th, with protesters throwing rocks and bottles, and cops hitting back with clubs and whips. That time, it was the city of Montgomery that backed down, promising Dr. King and the SNCC leaders that they would be gentler handling the protesters in the future. But Governor Wallace wasn't ready to back down, even after the judge ruled on the 17th that the protesters could march. So President Johnson stepped in. And on the 21st of March, protected by units of the Alabama National Guard, whom the president had put on federal orders for the purpose, and I'm just going to interrupt here and say, you're not going to convince me that wasn't a middle finger from Johnson to Wallace. Anyway, about 8,000 marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge and headed toward Montgomery. They didn't all make the whole march. The judge's order limited most of the middle part of the march to 300 people. So 8,000 left Selma, then most of them peeled off to rejoin the march when they got closer to Montgomery. And by the time they left their last camp on the morning of the 25th of March to march into Montgomery, they had something like 25,000 people with them. They marched to the state capitol, where Dr. King gave a speech. State troopers told him the governor wasn't in and wouldn't let him into the capitol. So 25,000 people waited in front of the Alabama state capitol until an aide finally came out and took the petition they had brought. Of course, the march didn't really fix anything. One woman, Viola Liuzzo, was killed by the Klan as she drove protesters back to Selma from Montgomery. And George Wallace, who had been elected on a promise to maintain segregation, still didn't budge. And the FBI tried to make it look like some of the protesters were communist. And some folks tried to put it out that the whole march had just been a giant traveling orgy. But Congress took the bill President Johnson presented to him on the 15th of March and debated it and passed it. And Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act on the 6th of August, 1965. The Voting Rights Act probably would have happened without the marches, without Bloody Sunday, and without the 3 deaths. But it sure didn't hurt, and the attention it got from the media and the country probably sped things up a little bit. And it made Dr. King even more prominent, and he remained the face of the civil rights movement until an assassin named James Earl Ray shot him down on the 4th of April, 1968 in Memphis. And all you have to do is drive through your city to see that I'm not the only one who still makes an effort to remember him. Just about every town in the U.S. has a street named after Martin Luther King Jr. Every leader who wants to position themselves as a civil rights champion gets compared to him. And on the 3rd Monday of January, you'll see articles online, speeches praising him and arguing about whether our country is living up to his dream. For my part, I think we mostly are. We've still got plenty of problems, and we got plenty of work to do, and we've lost some ground here in the last few years and even in the last few days. And we're going to have to pay close attention in the years to come. But I have to believe we're going to keep moving in the right direction, even if we take a step backward every now and then. because Dr. King's dream is not something you can kill. I don't care who you are, you're not putting that genie back in the bottle. As long as we're willing to stand up for what's right and to remember that every one of us is worthy of being judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character, we can keep Dr. King's legacy and his dream alive. Well, I hope you enjoyed this war story. If you did, please give me a thumbs up and remember to hit that like button. And don't forget to tell your friends about me. Till next time, I'm Scott, reminding you to piss when you can. Have a good one, and go keep the dream alive.